Hey, everybody. My name is Dr. Scott Giacomucci. I'm the director and founder of the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Therapy, which is located here in Media, Pennsylvania. Today, I want to talk to you about continuous traumatic stress disorder and continuous traumatic stress. Most people have heard of post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic stress, and at this point, most people have even heard of complex PTSD. But have you ever heard of CTSD, continuous stress disorder? This is something that I actually never have heard anyone in the United States even talk about. It was something that I heard about at an international group therapy conference in a trauma workshop. And when I heard it, it really stuck with me. I thought, man, this is a word, a name, a label for something that I've been seeing in many of my clients, something that shows up in many of the cases that we work with at the Phoenix Center, something that many of my trainees and supervisees and students are encountering. And we often are noticing that the typical approach to trauma and post-traumatic stress just doesn't work for continuous traumatic stress. So continuous traumatic stress describes what happens when the trauma and the danger never ends. CTSD is not an official diagnosis. It's not in the DSM-5, but it's a term that's used by some therapists and some researchers. And it refers to the psychological impact of ongoing and repeated traumatic threats or traumatic events, rather than just a single trauma. Now, that might sound similar to complex PTSD, and in some ways it is similar because of the repeated nature of it. But the major difference between continuous traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder is that with continuous traumatic stress, the trauma and the adversity continues to happen. It hasn't ended. Whereas with complex PTSD, there's often an assumption that the trauma has ended, although that isn't always an assumption that's made. So these are very similar and have a lot of overlap, but they're also different. So unlike typical PTSD, which develops after the trauma has ended, CTSD, continuous traumatic stress disorder, reflects living under persistent fear and danger and trauma. Some examples of continuous traumatic stress contexts would be living in a war zone, or living in an area of political violence, or being a refugee, or folks who are displaced and facing ongoing persecution, living in high crime or gang-dominated neighborhoods, survivors of domestic violence who continue to live within unsafe relationships and living situations. We could even think about someone who's, say, a person of color who continues to live in a racist environment that discriminates against them and dehumanizes them as another form of continuous traumatic stress. So now that we understand how it shows up or the causes of continuous traumatic stress, it's important that we look to how it manifests, the symptoms of it. So continuous traumatic stress is characterized by a state of constant hypervigilance and alertness for danger, looking around, waiting for the shoe to drop, walking on eggshells, feeling like there is no such thing as safety. A difficulty relaxing. Our body stays on guard all the time because we're constantly stressed about the next trauma we're going to experience, or really the ongoing trauma we are experiencing. Sleep disturbances, anxiety, exhaustion, being chronically stressed all the time and feeling unsafe is just exhausting. It takes all of our energy away. Leaves us with feelings of helplessness and hopelessness and despair, and feeling like safety is unreachable. One recent research study on continuous traumatic stress disorder, which was done in Gaza, in Palestine, it concluded that CTSD is similar to PTSD, but distinctly different in that there was an emphasis on three specific factors. The first was a sense of rage and betrayal, that living in ongoing trauma leaves us angry, pissed off, betrayed, feeling like we've been stabbed in the back. The second, a sense of exhaustion and detachment, just leaves us feeling unmotivated, feeling like life is meaningless and that it's hard to trust others. And the third was a sense of fear and helplessness, that the ongoing experiences of repeated traumas leaves us afraid of what's going to happen next, or what future do we have, or what can we even do to change our circumstances if this trauma continues again and again and again and again. So continuous traumatic stress disorder is different from PTSD in these three ways: the sense of rage and betrayal, the sense of exhaustion and detachment, and the sense of fear and helplessness. Before we go any further in the video, I want to share a quick message with you. I want you to know that we see people heal from trauma every day, and we believe that this is possible for you too. No matter what you've been through or what you've experienced, there is hope for healing. And there are caring professionals that are able to help you. At the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Therapy, we specialize in helping individuals move beyond trauma, grief, and difficult life experiences. We provide in-person therapy in Media, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia, or online therapy for those in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. We also offer online trauma recovery coaching and professional consultation for clients and professionals around the world. If we aren't a good fit for what you're looking for, we might be able to offer you some suggestions of other trusted colleagues that you could work with. You don't have to try to deal with the trauma or grief alone. Learn more about our services, fees, and therapists on our website, where you can also schedule a free intake call and start your trauma therapy or recovery coaching journey with us. All right, back to the video. So post-traumatic stress is rooted in the past. The danger is over, but the body is still reacting as if it's not. I often like to think of PTSD as symptoms or experiences from the past trauma showing up here and now in the present moment. But that's a little different than continuous traumatic stress disorder, where the symptoms are rooted in the present. The danger is not over, it continues to happen. PTSD treatments and most trauma therapies assume that safety exists and that the trauma has ended. And most trauma therapies were designed to work with PTSD, with this implicit assumption and starting point that the trauma has ended, with this assumption that it's possible to establish a sense of safety with a client. The problem with using those same trauma therapies with continuous traumatic stress disorder is that the safety can't be reestablished with CTSD. The client, the individual, continues to experience ongoing trauma. And so our interventions have to be different. They have to be adapted. We have to balance the importance of coping, surviving, and adapting while still living in the trauma and living under threat. And so I think this is particularly important to understand the difference between PTSD or CPTSD with continuous traumatic stress disorder, or CTSD. It really helps us normalize the experience of those who don't feel safe yet, and to understand that they're not failing at recovery, they're not treatment resistant, they're not hopeless. We just don't have the interventions or knowledge of the interventions to best help them. Or we haven't figured out how to adapt our interventions to work with someone who's continuing to experience trauma. So understanding this can help us as clinicians adapt these approaches to focus on harm reduction and community support and safety planning, coping skills, rather than only trying to reprocess trauma. It can help us raise awareness of the ways that social conditions, social forces, politics perpetuate ongoing trauma. So most professionals don't have any training on how to work with continuous traumatic stress. All the popular trauma therapies are created to treat trauma after it has ended. It's important that we help our clients experiencing ongoing trauma develop coping skills for surviving, especially when they're living in ongoing dangerous situations. Now, this might be as simple as grounding techniques and self-regulation techniques, or developing small rituals to create a semblance of safety in the moment. But this also has to involve developing support networks and hoping to cultivate community resilience while advocating for systemic change to address the social forces that are creating unsafe conditions. Of course, professional therapy can always be helpful, but it's got to be adapted to the reality of the ongoing trauma, the ongoing threat that one might be living in. And I think one of the more complicated nuances of working with continuous traumatic stress is that many times, based on the collective nature of ongoing trauma, that many times the therapist that's treating the client is also struggling with continuous traumatic stress because they're probably living in the same environment as the client. Think about the war in Ukraine and how civilians are struggling with continuous traumatic stress. The catch is that all the therapists are also struggling with continuous traumatic stress because they're living in the same country that's been invaded by Russia. So continuous traumatic stress is particularly complicated with that added nuance. Continuous traumatic stress disorder reminds us that trauma doesn't always end when the event does. And for many, the event doesn't end either. It continues. It happens again and again. And that survival means living under continuous trauma and continuous stress. And healing requires both personal and collective safety. So my hope is that this video is helpful in really differentiating, understanding, and having the language to talk about continuous traumatic stress and continuous traumatic stress disorder as similar to, but uniquely different than PTSD and complex PTSD. If you found this video helpful, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel to get notified about future videos. And leave a comment. Let us know what struck you as really significant or helpful about this video, or anything you feel like I may have been missing in this video too.